All right, good morning, everybody. We'd like to welcome Garrick Colwell from the Kitchen Table Conversations to Caregiving Cafe. Garrick is very experienced at talking about grief and loss and how to deal with it, how to manage it, and as well as many other emotions that are come across not only at end of life, but throughout life, and especially during caregiving. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Garrick. Garrick, welcome again. Thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. Please let us know a little bit about what you've done and what you do and why you do it. And then on with the show.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be here. It's good to see you all. And those of you who will be joining us in the recording. My name is Garrick Colwell. I live in Austin, Texas, and part-time in Bergheim, Texas, which is just north of San Antonio. And I'm in this part of the life cycle because it's been a passion of mine since 1987 when I first became a hospice volunteer. What I'm going to talk about today has to do with loss. Means too much loss. You know, how do you cope with grief overload? Because grief is a part of our lives. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, give you some tools and some tips, some techniques, give you some resources that you can use and come back to do a deeper dive in. But the idea today is to have a conversation. There's a nonprofit organization called kitchentableconversations.org that my late wife, who you can see over my left shoulder, a picture of her on the mantle here. Her name is Kinslow. She and I, along with 20 other healthcare professionals, created this nonprofit called Kitchen Table Conversations. And you can see what we do in the space of advanced care planning, end-of-life planning, and grief and mourning education. People at this part of their journey through this life, because if I check my stats here in the 5-county area of Central Texas, you know, the trend for the mortality rate in this area is still 100%. We're not going to get out of here alive. And so therefore, it's important for us to have conversations about death and dying and grief and mourning, because that's just simply a part of life. And we plan for everything else. We might as well plan for end of life. We also might as well plan for making sure our loved ones are supported after we're gone when it comes to authentically mourning the losses that they will suffer in this lifetime. So let me just continue to tell you a little bit more about myself, and then we'll dive in. We've got a slide presentation I wanted to give you, but I also want you to understand this is a conversation that you and I and all of us are here to have, so you can stop me at any point in time that you want to have a question, or you can raise your hand. I believe there's a feature here where you can raise hand, and we can stop and I'll call on you. So this isn't meant for me just to drone on endlessly about what the topic here. It's meant to be a discussion so that you can actually take what it is that we're talking about and apply it to what it is that you're experiencing. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So my background is a volunteer in hospice since 1987. I've also served as a volunteer hospice and hospital chaplain. I do end of life and advanced care planning education, as well as grief support group facilitator and educator. And also I served as a patient advocate for my wife and for others as she was going through her journey with cancer. She and I married on the 1st of November of 2019. And 22 days later, she received a diagnosis of stage 4 metastatic melanoma. And she had less than 6 months to live. Kinslow lived for 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks after her diagnosis. She died here in this house in my arms on February 12th of 2019. So that's kind of give you a little bit of background and what I bring to this conversation. Education, I'm a certified grief educator through and David Kessler. I'm a grief support facilitator. I'm also a certified grief recovery specialist. I hold a certificate in grief and death studies from the Center for Loss and Life Transition, which is Dr. Alan Wolfelt's under his direction. As a matter of fact, I'll be leaving in a week's time and spending a week with Dr. Wolfelt in training, which I do with him at least once or twice a year. So my loss history is certainly, I have a father of 5, but 7 pregnancies actually, 2 miscarriages. I've been divorced, and you know a little bit about my late wife, Kinslow. I lost my father recently, about 15 months ago, due to COVID, and a very dear friend of mine, and actually my late wife as well, known him for 40 some odd years, died from COVID as well. So that's a little bit of my loss history. So I draw upon that to share stories with you. Grief. It's important that we're, in society, we're not really educated about grief. We're modeled it by our parents. And sometimes, it's robust, and other times they just simply said, we just don't talk about those things in this house. And in my house, it was kind of like, we just talked about it a little bit, and then we didn't talk about it anymore because it was too sad. And so oftentimes we wind up finding ourselves grieving in character because we don't necessarily know any better. But what we're going to do today is take a few minutes and actually talk about some fundamentals when it comes to grief, and why it's important to understand some of the myths and the misconceptions about it. So we kind of recalibrate and maybe set into motion deeper foundation for your own grief journey and what it is that you're experiencing. So from Dr. Wilfeld's point of view, and this book that I'm referring to and basing this webinar on, it's called Too Much Grief, Coping with Grief Overload. This is grief responds to awareness. When you educate yourself about grief and mourning, you're making the experience more understandable and more bearable. It becomes something you work on rather than something that simply happens to you. So it's important, to begin with, have an intention to heal, intention to embrace the pain, even though it may be unbearable. But at the same time, the intention sets in motion the actions that you'll take that'll allow you the opportunity to become like the opportunity to feel what you need to feel over the course of time in your own way and at your own pace. There's no right or wrong way to do this. There's the only one way to do it is the way that it's right for you. And only you know that. And you may feel 100% unsettled, even though I study this field, even though I've prepared. When after Kinslow died, I was with one of my family members, and they said, "Well, why are you so upset? Why are you so much in grief? You knew this was going to happen." I said, "You're right. I did know it was going to happen." And Kinslow and I talked a lot about this, but at the same time, that I was prepared, I wasn't ready. So when the reality comes in, to bear, where in fact you're actually suffered the loss, there's a whole bunch of confusion, a bunch of psychic numbing, a bunch of like shock, and so consequently, you're now on a new learning curve that is incredibly steep. It's you feel like you've lost your mind, and you don't necessarily know which way is up, and that's just part of being thrust into something you never wanted to happen in the first place, and at the same time trying to grapple with what it is that you may have as tools, which you might find yourself wanting, but you don't really know what they are. So you're going to have to discover them, and you naturally through this process turn inward, and you start looking for the tools that you need. And that's what grief education is about, is to talk about what those tools look like. Well, we'll spend our time together talking about, or highlighting actually, in this 30 or 45 minutes we have together. Maybe we'll spend a little bit longer depending upon how many questions you have, which is no problem. As many questions you have, I have the time to answer them. So talk about grief is in a natural and organic process, what the myths and misconceptions are, actually how to help a grieving friend, and then how that also emboldens and serves you as a griever on how it is that you might find yourself feeling more comfortable in your grief, if that even is possible. What the 6 needs of mourning are, and what is grief overload exercise, what a mourning plan looks like, and then there's some other webinars that you might be interested in attending. All the webinars I do are free. They're sponsored by AARP, and I've been doing this with AARP for the last 5 or 6 years. So it's a wonderful way of bringing this education to you. So grief is a natural and organic process. Grief and the need to authentically mourn is not an abnormal process, but a natural organic experience that allows us to integrate loss into our lives. The other day, I was, as a matter of fact, this morning, I was listening to David Kessler give a lecture at a grief summit, and he was talking about people asking, "Well, David, how long will I grieve? How long will I grieve the loss of my wife or my husband?" And David's response, "Well, I guess the question really is, how long will they be dead?" because you'll grieve them for the rest of your life. It's just the normal process that we go through. And it's normally how it is that we integrate the loss into our lives over the course of time. So we're integrating, we're not getting over. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Grief is a spiritual and emotional experience, and while it responds to awareness, it cannot be controlled by logic. So it's not of the head, it's of the heart. It's a journey of the heart. And sometimes we want to, try and re-exert control over a situation that's incredibly chaotic and unsettling, but really we have to feel our way through it. In other words, you have to feel it to heal it. So when grief becomes physical, we have a heaviness in our heart. We have a broken heart syndrome. It winds up feeling like there's heaviness in our chest, someone sitting on our chest. I had this symptom, probably for a little over a year, maybe a little bit longer. I just felt I just couldn't breathe deeply enough. I couldn't get this off my chest, so to speak. And basically, it's just the way it worked. And so I went to the doctor, got checked out. There was not any cardiac issues. It just simply was grief and the feeling of through that grief. Oftentimes experience lower immunity because we're producing types of white blood cells, leaving us prone to infection. So we have a lot of cortisol running through our system, where it creates body aches and pains. These are just the natural symptoms that are part and parcel of grief. These stress hormones typically are cortisol because we're anxious. We're not concerned. Our concern is about our future. Our world is just turned upside down. Kinsel and I married. 22 days later, we had stage 4 diagnosis. Now we're in a place where our whole world was turned upside down. No longer looking at the idea that we'd spend the rest of our lives together. No longer looking at the idea that we would be traveling to these places in the world that we had talked about. No longer, looking at working together in counseling and working together in education. All those things were shattered on the 22nd of November 2014 when we received that diagnosis. So anxiety, what's to come? What are we going to do? What's going to happen to her? All that is part and parcel of the cortisol that runs through your mind, your body, and the adrenaline as well. Digestive issues. Sometimes we want to seek comfort foods. I certainly weighed, probably 30 more pounds than I weigh now, at least, maybe more, when I was going through this with her. Because I ate, and that was my comfort, or one of the ways I found some semblance of comfort in the midst of all that. Unhealthy coping mechanisms. People sometimes will turn, if they have the tendency to do high-risk behaviors, to, and also turn to alcohol, cigarettes, or overeating, or not eating at all, becoming anorexic. Sleep and fatigue is a huge issue when it comes to the physical grief manifesting physically. Certainly you sleep a little bit and then don't want to sleep a lot, or you sleep all the time and you still feel fatigued. Grief is hard work. Mourning is hard work. It is one of the hardest jobs, if you will, that you will ever have. And certainly self-identity. On February 12th at 4:35 Central Time, 2019, I no longer was a husband. I no longer was a caregiver. I no longer was an advocate. I lost my purpose, my direction. I lost the sense of who I was. And so that had to be rebuilt over the course of time. But that feeling of just that being vacated in a heartbeat, basically, from one moment to the next, was overwhelming. It's profound. It's that deep, deep silence where that abyss you fall into and you go, gosh, I have no idea who I am. So you have to rebuild that. You have to go through and intentionally, figure out over the course of time what that looks like. So let's stop there and talk about a little bit, if there's any questions about the physical parts of grief, how they show up, some of the challenges that you may face around that, some of the issues that you may have experienced around the physicality of grief and mourning.
Anybody have any comments?
Comments or questions? Okay.
First, I just want to say thank you for sharing that and being so vulnerable in sharing all of your loss. A lot of times when we go through loss, as an individual, you tend to feel like nobody else can understand. And sometimes you hear stories of grief that is far greater than something that you've experienced, and other times, on par and everything. But the vulnerability that you shared is greatly appreciated, and also helps in understanding sort of the emotions that I know I went through with the loss of my family. But I just wanted to thank you for that.
You're welcome. Welcome.
And if I may, I see you now, Sharon. Welcome again. Garrick, you mentioned something very poignant that I've heard of several times. I have heard of many Carries passing in the last couple of years. I mean, lots. And one of the things that keeps coming up is, what do I do now? Like you said, at that instant, you cease to be a spouse in your situation, but also a caregiver. And so you lose your sense of direction, your purpose. What do I do now? What am I? Who am I? And then having to come up with something else to fill your day. It's I guess it must be like retiring when and this I've also heard many times, oh gosh, I used to do this and that, 50 hours a week or 80 hours a week. And now what do I do? Who am I? Am I still helpful, useful, worth anything? So all of that, in addition to the grief that we experience for our loved one, that big change in us, so we have this duality of loss.
We're betwixt and between. We're in what we call liminal space. We don't have a place that we have that anchors us, that defines us, that gives our life meaning anymore. And so we're in that space where we're not really sure. And that's part of a natural course of the grieving process, and being, the kind of the rug pulled out from underneath you. And oftentimes that's when we panic. We engage in a activity like, I've got to find a solution. I've got to find a reason. I go back into my head and trying to solve it with logic. And really, it's one of those things we have to just sit with it and find others that understand. Find a group that actually can see and hear you and not judge you, but just allow you to be where you need to be as you explore and discover, because we innately know what to do. We may have to take time to uncover that, to discover that within ourselves, but that only happens as we turn inward and as we relate to people who can witness us and see us for who we are in the moment. And so we've wind up understanding how to discern who we speak to about our grief, because some people say, oh, it's been 6 months, you should be over it by now. Or, you're not crazy, but you sure are acting crazy, but that's not helpful. It might be true, but it's not helpful. So finding a group of people, or someone, at least another individual that understands and can companion you, in other words, walk shoulder to shoulder with you, and not necessarily judge you at all, but allow you to be where you need to be, allows you the space and the safe harbor where you can actually discover, as you're walking through this liminal space, what it is, or rediscover what it is that you want to be and where you want to go. And it could be just as simply as saying, hey, today I got out of bed. Today I washed my clothes after a week or 2 or a month. Today I actually had a meal prepared for myself. So those are wins, but they look like from the outside going, really? You haven't been, washing your clothes for a month? What's wrong with you? And that's, again, not helpful. You want to find people who support you and realize, oh, okay. Maybe Tuesday I can come over and help you finish it up. I'll be there Tuesday at 10 o'clock and we'll get the rest of the wash done. Would that be helpful? So you give people choices to help and support. But yeah, liminal space is the tough place to be.
Yeah. Okay. I have just 2 quick things. I'm not sure if it's my computer, but the sound gets crackly sometimes. So I'm not sure if that's me or.
No, it's crackly as well.
Okay. And the other thing is, what would be an appropriate response to somebody saying you should be over that by now, or okay, but I'm not. Okay, so what would be, because like you said, it doesn't feel good. It's not supportive, and people mean well generally, but sometimes the wrong things, they come out the wrong way.
Yeah, they do mean, yeah, they do mean well primarily, and they also speak out of their own experience, their own fear, their own anxiety about dealing with the topic of death and dying. And so you've got to take into account. So here you are, the griever, and you're the one actually having to provide counsel for someone who takes a response and gives it back to you in that way. And then number one is to allow them to be where they are, because what they think of how you're grieving is really none of your business. First of all. Secondly, is that you basically allow them to be where they need to be, as you want them to allow you to be. And if you're looking for support, you're not going to look to that person in the future for the kind of support you're looking for. You're going to look to someone else who can actually provide that to you. So there's a frustration. So why don't my friends understand me? Why does my family not get this? Because everybody grieves the loss differently. My grief for my father, I grieve the loss of my father differently than my sister and mother. The loss of my wife is grieved differently than the way her brothers grieve her. And so you have to respect that's the case, and also not have an expectation of someone who may not just be the same place you are, or not be in that place where they can be present to you. I do an entire webinar on what to say, what not to say to someone grieving. And actually it's going to be next Thursday at 10:30, and you can go on the website and register for free. But it's very specifically this point, is that, what to say, what not to say, because there are things that are helpful and there are things that are not so helpful.
Yes. So, all right. Well, thank you.
Okay. All right. So let's go back to the sides and we'll continue. How much more time would you like me to go?
Oh, well, you can use up another half hour if you like.
All righty. Sounds good. So misconceptions, this is one of those things that sometimes is another interesting conversation, because people think that grief and mourning are the same, when in fact they're not. Grief is internal, mourning is external. You will naturally grieve, but you will probably have to make a conscious, intentional, and regular effort to mourn. Grief is what we feel on the inside. Mourning is what we do with our grief when we express it. We express it through crying, through journaling, through keen, through wailing, through taking action, building things. Like as an example, when after Kinslow died, she died in February, and so that spring of that same year, in April, I started redoing the entire back garden, because it was something that she loved, and we had in process to some degree, but I went back and redid it all and refreshed everything. And while I was doing it, I was able to talk with her. I was able to see her with me and have a conversation with her about the garden and about what was going on, and how she can would always give me advice on what to do and where to put this. And she had a beautiful sense of space and form. So it was just a wonderful way to not only mourn her through action, but also to memorialize and honor her through the conversations we had. So grief and mourning aren't the same. Grief is what we feel on the inside. Mourning is what we do and how we express our grief outside. Important distinction. Action over time heals all wounds. Actually, it's action over time. Setting the intention to heal sets in motion the fact that you're going to have movement. You're going to move the grief into mourning, that you're going to do the things that you feel appropriate at the appropriate time to begin to heal through allowing your grief to be expressed through the mourning. So it's action over time that heals wounds. Grief is linear. Now there are 6 stages of grief. David Kessler wrote a book called Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief, with the blessing of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. He and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross co-wrote 2 books. One of them is on grief and grieving, which is the book they used to translate her 5 stages of death into the 5 stages of grieving. And then he added a 6th stage of meaning. But at the very first page of the book on grief and grieving, it was very clearly stated by both of them that this is not a linear process. Grief is not linear. Matter of fact, it just simply is framework. It just simply is kind of a wireframe of how it is that what you might experience along the way. Certainly denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and meaning are all part of the grief journey, but they don't happen sequentially, and they don't happen in a particular order or with a particular time frame to them. So it's not linear. It's very, very messy. So these are just some more. I'll send you a copy of these slides if you like. You can request them. I'll be happy to share them with you so you can go back and review them. Sympathy is a passive pity. Empathy strives to actively engage and connect. Sympathy is feeling for, while empathy is feeling with. It's important to understand that, particularly if you're working with a grieving person. They don't need your sympathy, but the empathy is helpful. And of course, empathy leads to compassion. So important things to understand. Getting over grief after someone you love The goal should be to get over your grief as soon as possible. You'll never get over your grief. Instead, you'll learn to live with it. What happens, of course, is Elizabeth says that the reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss. You will learn to live with it. You will heal. You will rebuild yourself around the loss you suffered. The key words here are build yourself around the loss you suffered. You will be whole again, but you'll never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to be. When you have a loss, your life has changed forever. So what you're doing over the course of time, in your own way and in your own time, you're learning to grow around your grief. You're learning to integrate it into your life. And I integrate, so you can see, I've integrated the loss of my late wife into this work because it was, she means a great deal to me, and so does this work. And so I found meaning by allowing me to tell the stories that help support the learning that I'm sharing with you today and the conversations we're having about grief. You give yourself permission to grieve by recognizing the need for grieving. You could actually change that word out the end, call it mourning. So it's important that you recognize the need for mourning. It's important that you allow yourself and give yourself permission. Oftentimes at the very beginning, there's a lot of anger, and the anger is something we don't talk much about. It's a webinar actually I do as well, and we'll do in the future here, I think in June. I'm not sure. No, it's in October. I don't know. Anyway, it's on the website. And the bottom line is that there's a book that Dr. Wilfelt wrote about it because one of those topics that just isn't talked about very much, but anger is an intimate part of the grieving process. Anger is a protest emotions. It's our emotions bodyguard. It's what we use to, try and get some space and figure out what the heck is going on. So more about that in that webinar. So let me stop there and just check in with you guys again if there's questions about myths and misconceptions around grieving. And there isn't a requirement that you ask questions by any means. If you are just contemplative and you're just reflective, that's okay. I understand there's a lot of information here, and information may be new, may be interesting, and you kind of think, well, gee whiz, I never thought of it that way. And that's kind of the intention, is that this is something to broaden people's understanding about grief and mourning, and the fact that this is not the way we're typically taught, or that we talk much about in society.
Garrick, it's so very simple. I'm going, why didn't I think of that? Very helpful. You've really helped me see this much clearer.
Oh, wonderful. I'm going to thank you for that. I'm going to play a video, and this will kind of give us a perspective, or a kind of a, cornerstones to a foundation of understanding as to how we support someone else who's grieving, because obviously the people we care for, like Carrie, for my wife, I was with her 24/7 from the day of diagnosis. And so we were intimately talking about things and noodling through things. And, she's going through loss, as anticipatory loss, as I'm going through anticipatory loss leading up to the time when she died. And so as caregivers, we're also supporting someone who's grieving, as well as dealing with our own grief. And so it's important to know that how it is that we show up for them is part and parcel of how it is that we want to show up for others. But it's an intimate part of being a caregiver, that anticipatory grief. It's an important part. Matter of fact, where is it? On May 19th, I'm going to be doing a webinar on anticipatory grief. So May 19th is anticipatory grief. It's called expected grief, coping with anticipatory grief, or expected loss, coping with anticipatory grief. And it's going to be on May the 19th at 10:30 to 12. So you're welcome to sign up for that if you want it. Again, it's free. But it's a deeper dive into the anticipatory grief process, where that is, what it looks like, what we can do, some of the tools we can use to navigate that time, because it's very real. It's very, very real. And again, a topic we don't talk a lot about, but hopefully this webinar will provide some beneficial information.
And for the benefit of everybody, and Garrick, like I said, I've heard you talk before, and it is so incredibly important that we hear what you have to say, because most of us don't know that. And I said, why didn't we think of that? And it's very much needed, just like caregiving is. But I will post on an email, I'll send the information on your website, a link to your website. And I imagine everything is posted there when your seminar, your talks, because they're wonderful. So thank you for that. And just to touch on anticipatory grief, and it also helps. I saw this in my husband. He was like, you can't touch him. It hurts. It hurts like hurts. And so the patients go through this anticipatory expectation, or no, anxiety. It's anxiety. When you're thinking, oh, the nurse is going to touch me. She's going to touch me. She's going to touch me. I don't want her to touch. I mean, all of this was going on for about 2 hours before his appointment when I would take him in. And the first thing, the nurse walks in and she goes, I'm not going to touch you. I can see you're very anxious. I mean, she spotted it right away, you know, and immediately this, you know, sigh of relief, because, you know, and I was not familiar with anticipatory anxiety, much less anticipatory grief. You know, so that's really what you say in these talks can be adapted to many situations.
Yes.
You know, so, and that's the beauty of learning about, you know, your topics, you know, and as caregivers, it behooves us to adjust them to our own personal situation, and they really, really help. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. And one other thing, actually, before you move on, or maybe when it's appropriate to talk about it, I met with a past caregiver on Tuesday, and she said, I told her about your talk, and her husband passed away maybe 4 years ago, something like that. But she said, it's very interesting, she said, because she never cried at anybody's passing. Her mother, her father, her husband, no one. I couldn't cry. I just didn't cry. And normally it's kind of an expected thing, you cry. I have to say, I did not cry at my mom and dad's passing either. I think I was in shock. The first time my dad went first, I didn't know what to do with myself. My body, I swear I was in shock. You know, even though, like you said, you prepare all you want, but you're still taken by surprise, right? So, but anyway, so she was wondering, you know, is that weird? Am I weird? Is what she said, because I don't cry. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to ask that question.
No, I don't. I think everyone grieves in character. In other words, it depends, you know, how you were brought up. It depends upon what has influenced you over the course of time through the loss and how it's been modeled for you, what you feel most comfortable with. But, you know, the crying sometimes is not part of it. You know, there's a class of, or a section of us who are resilient grievers, and we just kind of, a matter of factly, kind of work our way through it. There's a whole bunch of work done around that. The papers and so they're written for that particular section of our population. So it's, you know, again, it's serving you. You're discovering what it is that best supports you. And so, do you not cry? Do you cry? I think that's it's a very personal question.
Okay. All right. Well, I will reassure
you. You've got to decide what is, if you want to find out, you can discover what's behind that. If you feel that you'd like to cry, but you just can't, then there may be something that is deeper in what is going on within you, set you up for not crying, because you were told that, you know, big girls don't cry. They just, you stuff your emotions, keep them to yourself. It's a private matter. Don't do it. And that maybe it's in the background, but if there's a need, but that's a self-discovery, you know, a personal deep dive into what's going on, and with the mourning and the grieving. It's an individual, very much so.
Thank you. I will tell my friend she's not weird.
No, she's not weird, but you know, absolutely. But if she has a concern, the thing to do is to seek someone out that is, you know, specializes in grief, or perhaps more complicated grief, and just feel that, you know, feel her way, you know, kind of walk through what it is that she is feeling, so that she's, you know, is able to honor and respect what it is that is coming up for her.
All right. Thank you.
All right, let's get back to the slides. And the point was made about anxiety. And I think this is something I wanted to just touch on so that you have a chance to a tool that you can use from what to do when you're feeling very anxious or panicked. So let's take a look at what we have here. These are, steps you can take. And this is something you can, either come back to the slides themselves or you can write down here. There are several key steps that are tools, things that you can actually do. So oftentimes when we're in a state of confusion, taking action, not just, any action, but in this case, take a breath, breathe deeply, take slow, deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. Inhale to a count of 4 and exhale to a count of 4. Very simple. I mean, these are, like Michael was saying, these are really simple things. Why didn't I think of that? And that means they're ringing true in some way because they make sense. They touch you in some way. So this is one of those simple things. Breathe in for 4, breathe out for 4. And take the count, not 1, 2, 3, 4. Take the count as 1, 2. Just breathe deeply as you do that. So you take a full breath of air. And basically what you're doing is you're bringing yourself in a mindful way back to the present moment. So breathe. Use your touchstone. Try carrying a small object that makes you feel grounded and safe, such as a special stone, a keepsake, an amulet. When you're feeling panicked, hold it in your hand and breathe deeply. So you can combine the two there. There's a thing called parting stones. For those of you that may have a conversation with your loved one, is that if they decide to be cremated, they can take their ashes and turn them into parting stones, P-A-R-T stones, partingstones.com. And these are smooth rocks that just fit in the palm of your hand. They're small and they're a touchstone. Some people feel the ashes made, they can into these stones, just helps them gives them an opportunity to feel close to their loved one. So a touchstone, maybe there's another object, maybe there's a picture, something that you can look at, but a keepsake of some sort. So use that in combination with your breathing. Certainly if you have a place to lie down as you're breathing deeply, using this exercise again, lie down and intensely focus on moving through your body, relaxing your muscles one at a time. Again, consciousness, being present to them and what it is during the moment. In this case, you're taking action by breathing. Repeat an affirmation, breathe deeply, but instead of counting as you breathe, try repeating an affirmation like I'm here. And as you exhale, I'm safe. So again, things that you can do, you can take action on to help bring your attention to the present moment. When we're anxiety, we're future projecting. Anxiety is a great emotion. It has a message for us because all emotions have messages in them. But each anxiety has the emotion or the message of saying, hey, if something's coming up you're not prepared for. But it can be out of control in the sense that it becomes hyper vigilant and you wind up future projecting and you take yourself right out of the moment, which is where you can actually take action, bring your attention back to the moment. And then from there, in a place of calm, be able to address what it is that the future holds. Go for a walk. If you're able to, try going for a short walk whenever your anxiety builds. The moment, the movement, the change of environment, and fresh air will likely clear your heart and mind and restore you to yourself. So these are basically 5 things that you can do when you're feeling anxious or panicked. Breathe deeply, use your touchstone, lie down and relax your muscles, repeat an affirmation, or go for a walk. Very important. So there's a tool for you. So let's go on to check in about what grief is and a definition of what it is, so we can talk more specifically about our topic. It is what you feel when you experience too many significant losses all at once or in a relatively short period. It's different from typical grief because it comes from more than one loss and it's jumbled. Everything gets mixed together and people say, well, how do I grieve all this? Because it is chaotic and it can feel very defeating. Like you got knocked off your feet too many times. You're kind of punch drunk. It can come because of tragic incidences like natural disasters, car accidents, active violence, or it can cause the deaths of multiple people you care about all at once. It can be a traumatic grief. All grief is not all grief is traumatic, but all trauma has grief in it. It is so traumatic grief is grief that has an added component of intense fear, other challenging symptoms caused by violent nature of a cause of death. And that comes up as flashbacks, memory gaps, persistent negativity or intrusive thoughts, low self-esteem, hypervigilance or anxiety, personality changes, and or any inability to handle the task for daily living are part of your grief overload experience. It's important you see your primary physician. So make sure you have a baseline of what's going on with you physically, so you don't miss that. And then it's important for you to seek out a trauma-trained grief counselor. EMDR is a method of training of modality, healing modality. A trauma-trained grief counselor might have. EMDR is very, very effective when it comes to trauma. So I've actually participated in that therapy before, and it was very effective for me. So there's something for you to consider, particularly if it's traumatic grief, which is a part of grief overload. Back-to-back losses also is part of grief. Death that might happen within a few days or weeks of each other, within months or a few years, where you feel family saying, "Oh, gee, I lost 5 family members this year." Well, that's definitely grief overload. The losses other than death can be a job, a divorce, health issues, estrangement, moving away from a beloved home or location. These are all legitimate losses. I mean, there's not a loss that isn't legitimate. Let me put it that way. Loss is loss. And, who's got more loss than the other person? When you start comparing, well, when you start comparing, you get out of your heart and move into your head. And your head's not broken. It's your heart that's broken. So comparing really doesn't help, because the most significant loss that anyone has is your loss. Your loss is the most significant loss at the time. So that's what you're dealing with. There's also, that contributes to grief overload, is secondary losses. Secondary loss in my case was self-identity. Who was I? What was my purpose and meaning? Loss of your hope for future. We certainly experienced that after the diagnosis with Kinslow. Potential loss of financial security. Certainly that was on the horizon. And then companionship. I certainly dearly, dearly miss her. Her company, her sense of humor. She's a brilliant individual, just a profoundly brilliant, beautiful person. So cumulative losses, loss over time, pets die. Pets loss is just as legitimate as a human loss. Friendships break and other hardships present themselves year after year after year. And if you don't grieve and mourn each loss as it arises, this is the key, you end up carrying unreconciled or carried over grief, which eventually adds up and becomes an unsustainably weighty burden. So at some point in time, grief comes calling. If you don't do it today, if you've stuffed it, you may find up you have carried over grief that you're, all of a sudden now you're 5 years later, 10 years later, and someone else dies, and all of a sudden you think, oh my gosh, I'm feeling, the loss of my friend that had died 10 years ago. How in the world is that case? Well, there's just a little bit more to grieve, but grief will come knocking. Grief overload in the elderly, this is obviously true. Increasingly, their friends and peers begin to die in faster succession. My mother is experiencing this. She's 90 years old. And, all her friends, except very, very few, are no longer here. In her case, she does not have deteriorating health, which is pretty remarkable. She's got some aches and pains, and she addresses them directly, and she's not happy with them. Sometimes it's funny to call her and says, "What's going on?" She says, she starts being mad at her body for not behaving like she wants it to. And she's hilarious. It's hilarious to listen to. So accumulated a great deal of grief carried over the course of their lives. So again, it's important to grieve as you go. Caregiver grief overload is, as a professional, as a volunteer, as a family member, or as a friend, you've got to be watchful and be good with that. Important to do that. So that's kind of like what grief overload looks, kind of a scope or perspective on what it looks like. And then in the next few minutes, I'll kind of give you an exercise here. So one of the exercises you do is you basically sit down, you inventory all the losses, anticipated, recent, past, secondary, death-related, non-death-related, that may be contributing to your current experience of grief overload. If you feel you have grief overload, this is a great exercise to sit down and do, because it now takes out of the confusion that's in our minds and puts it on paper, and you start being able to see it in black and white. And this leads to what will ultimately be what I'll leave you with today as a tool that you can use to actually manage this, if you will, or you can experience this in a more orderly fashion. So it takes it out of the cloud and puts it on paper as you take an inventory. Identify the losses you're grieving is the start of creating an action plan to mourn them and heal. So that's important. This is the beginning of creating an action plan. So inventory all the losses. And I mean do a loss history. You can go all the way back to childhood. And if you feel grief overload, you want to sort it out, then go back as far as you're willing to go back, but don't be afraid of going back to childhood. And so that gives you a perspective. You can put that in time. You know, I lost my dad on January 31st of 2021 in my case. But you could go back and say, well, gee whiz, if I lost my parents when I was 5 years old, I put that, lost my mom on this date, you know, or in this year. So that starts to give you a perspective of how much loss you've dealt with. And you may find that you feel like, oh, I feel really sad, or I'm not really complete on that. And these things may start to come up so that you can work with them. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. With grief or with loss comes change of who we are, because we're changed forever by the loss. So what this leads to, if you've done your if you've done your loss inventory, your loss history, as it were, then you can actually engage in trying to look at what a mourning plan looks like. A mourning plan is taking the 6 needs of mourning, which I did not cover yet, but they're right here, and they're covered in more depth earlier in the slide deck. But acknowledging the reality of the grief or of the loss, that's really important. It's hard to do. I mean, it's oftentimes why the second year of mourning is the most difficult year. It's not the first year, as oftentimes people, I mean, David Kessler defines early grief as the first 2 years. Not the first year, not the first 6 months or the first 90 days, but 2 years. Because sometimes I hear this many, many times throughout the week, where people are saying, my second year is just much more brutal than my first. And I'm not trying to scare you into anything. I'm just trying to give you a perspective on what people are saying. And the reason is that because they're coming to full awareness of the fact that their loved one's not going to be walking through the door at 5 o'clock after work to sit down and have dinner. It's not going to happen. I can't tell you that how many times I left this house and traveling after Kinslow died, and came back and turned the key in the back door and walked in thinking, and actually first time I did, I says, honey, I'm home. And I just collapsed, fell to my knees, because I realized that, oh, that's not happening. She isn't home. She's not here. She never will be here. And it took me many trips before my mind, which is wired for this. I mean, the neurons that fire together wire together. And so I was wired, my neurons were wired that she was going to be here, that she was here. She'd always been here. Every time I left and came back, she was always here when I came back. And so why would she be? And so you had to reprogram your neurons, basically. You have to unwire them to what they were wired to, and the memory of the fact, not that you're losing the memory, but you're just simply, that's no longer the reality. And so The Grieving Brain is a new book that came out. It's called The Grieving Brain, and it came out just in the last few months. And it brilliantly walks through the studies and all the support for what we're talking about here. So I would say, The Grieving Brain is a great book for getting perspective on why we continue to believe that they're going to be there when in fact they're not. It's our mind is wired that way. When we have a relationship with someone, I wire in where I'm wired as to where my wife is. I mean, I know where throughout the day, what was going on, where she was, and so forth. And so I have all that mapped out in my brain. And so when she died, it's like all that had to be allowed to be where it is, but realize that's not the reality. But acknowledging the reality of the loss gives you the opening to create momentum behind your grief, and you turn it into mourning. You're embracing the pain versus turning away from it. It's counterintuitive, but as we lean into the pain, it actually will allow us to learn to and soften that pain so that we can remember them with more love than pain over the course of time. Remembering is an important part of it. Sometimes I just sit down with our wedding album and look through it, because that's just what it feels like the right thing to do. Developing a new self-identity, which we talked about. Searching for meaning. Searching for Meaning is a book written by David Kessler, Finding Meaning. So highly recommend that book as well. And then receive support from others. I mean, seek out those people who will not judge you, allow you to be where you need to be. And so what you do is you look at these 6 needs of mourning, and you take a look at the top, and you look at the losses. You put each one of the losses in here, and you take a look at week to week. How am I doing when it comes to these losses? And when it comes to these 6 needs of mourning? Very important part of how it is you start framing it. So what happens is, a friend of mine is a minister lost his granddaughter, and he, of course, has to attend to his congregation. But what he does is he makes an appointment with his grief. And when he's preparing for bed, taking a shower, that's where he gives himself permission to engage with his grief and authentically mourn and cry and do whatever it is that he needs to do in reflection as he allows that grief to turn into mourning. David Kessler the other day was talking about how he actually talks about his son when he comes on TV or a program, or he's doing a lecture or whatnot, is he actually makes time ahead of time to talk about with himself and grieve and mourn that which he's going to speak about in just a few minutes, so that he has an opportunity to give grief its due, give grief its space and time. So the mourning plan is simply allowing you an opportunity, creating an opportunity for you to be mindful and be put attention on each loss, perhaps as it relates to each one of the mourning needs of mourning, and see how you were doing with it, or what you might do to engage in how in remembering a little bit more, or how it is you're engaging in a new self-identity, or how it is you're engaging in receiving support from others or searching for meaning. So it kind of puts a framework around it so that you have something to work with, a plan, an action plan. Again, it's action over time that heals. It's not just simply time. So your mourning plan is that, seeing a counselor suggests that you have, if you take your mourning plan with you, suggest that some of the sessions focus on specific losses. You can attend a loss-specific in-person or online support groups. Hospices like yours, I believe, will add or offer those, or you can seek outside the hospice world also the groups that you can attend that are online. Do a journal. Absolutely. Dedicate one journal to each loss. So you can write about them. When you give time to that grief, bring out your journal. Write about that loss. Write about what it is that you're feeling, not what you're thinking, what your to-do list is. Our tendency is to go back into our head because we don't necessarily want to dive into the emotions. But give yourself space and time for introspection and reflection, and you can take that to the page. Write it down. Make an appointment with yourself to mourn a specific loss, as I was telling you, my friend Bradley does. And then be self-compassionate. You may need to adjust your expectations about both the intensity and duration of this naturally complicated experience, but give yourself space and allow yourself to change and adjust, to stay true to what it is that you're feeling, stay true to your inner guidance as to what to do next. Be self-compassionate. And Christian Neff, who is a professor here at UT in Austin, has done the quintessential work and the seminal piece on self-compassion. And so you can find that at selfcompassion.com or selfcompassion.org. I'm not sure which, but Dr. Neff is, just matter of fact, just did a conference just recently, last week or so, on self-compassion and the importance of how it is we embrace that, give ourselves that space. So trust your grief. This is the important part. And I'll leave you with this quote from Dr. Wolfeld. Trust your grief, listen to it, learn from it, allow it to lead and teach you at its own pace, what it is it needs. You will eventually experience a sense of self-direction as you give your attention to mourning. This is what we based the conversation on, is this book here. You can find it at the Center for Loss and Life Transition. It's $9.95. It's about 50 pages, and it's just packed with information and tools and techniques that you can use in around the idea of how you deal with grief overload. All right. Questions or thoughts? Stop here.
Thank you, Garrick. That was wonderful. I talk too much, so I'm going to let somebody else talk.
Wow. I was moved to tears, and I think a few other people were too, because listening to you, you don't even realize what you haven't dealt with. That's what I'm going to say. I can't say much more because I will cry.
Yeah.
Oh.
Now that you're at that threshold, maybe it's time. It could be time to set aside time, make an appointment. Be good to yourself, make an appointment in loss history, and see where things are that you might want to go back into or might want to work with, and use that as a guide for how it is that you want to put special attention on those areas that you feel drawn to.
Garrick, again, this was very, very helpful. I really appreciate this. It's very encouraging too, because I can see some of these things that I have done, not knowing I was doing the right thing, I guess you could say.
Mhm.
Like making an appointment with grief. I've told people that at times I just sit down on the couch and cry, and then after a few minutes I get up and I'm better. But realizing
I
what
would
I've
just
done
applaud
good
you
and what
for
I've
that.
done bad is really helpful. I appreciate that.
And I applaud you for the courage to do that, Michael, because the thing is that, and partly what you're saying also, Dura, is the fact that when we have 1,000 tears to cry, you can't stop at 354. They're there. They're there to be expressed. And as you might say, this too shall pass. I mean, you'll cry, and then there'll be a time when you're not crying. But the release that comes through crying, if that's the way you're grieving or mourning at that time, it's invaluable. It's invaluable to be able to embrace that emotion. Back to the point is that emotions need motion. And that is one of the ways that we express our grief. We turn that into mourning through crying. It's wonderful, Michael. Thank you for sharing that.
Anybody else? Sharon, did you want to say something? You're muted. You're muted, Sharon.
Well, I didn't want, because I'm outside
Yeah.
and there's construction and the dogs were barking, but I like it outside.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But
Yeah.
I couldn't, well, I'm on my phone instead of my computer because I couldn't get it up on the computer,
Okay.
the Zoom meeting. So I thought, well, I'll just go outside. And then I didn't want everybody to hear my neighborhood sounds.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, that's fine. And I'm glad
Yeah.
that you joined us. Welcome. So did you have any questions or
No,
comments?
I'm just, I haven't been at a meeting in a bit, and I saw that this topic was just, grief and mourning, which is we're all going to go through, and we've already been through probably, and it's going to be more than once. And I like the concepts of the grief and the more, the differences.
Mhm.
That grief happens, and it's an internal thing and emotional, and then we mourn it by like our actions. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it totally makes sense.
Mhm.
And it's a good way. And also kind of making a inventory kind of losses, that maybe have been grieved but not fully grieved, or maybe not grieved at all. And then kind of looking at that, and then going through taking care of yourself and kind of getting through this process. It's like, yeah, it's
Thank you,
good.
Sharon.
Yeah, it's a very good, timely, and just for everybody, anybody, even young people, because they may have lost grandparents or pets, or it's just, there's a lot of loss in life. It's part
Yeah,
of
that's
life.
true. Yeah.
It's part of life, and
Yeah.
and it's harder for some people to kind of accept that and deal with it, or look at it. But we're all different, so there's no right or wrong. There is nothing that we have to do, but I think it's all about trying to move forward, and look at ourselves and how we're dealing and coping and finding joy, mixing in some good stuff in with all the part of life that's sad,
Mhm.
and it's just this topic is just awesome, and it's good for everybody. And I'm glad that I looked at it and I thought, oh, and then it took me a while to get on, so I missed the very early part of his talk, which I meant, I know it was about losing his wife and a personal history, and that's, I'm sorry I missed the beginning of it. I kind of chimed in at the end. But anyway, thank you. I'm really glad I came today, or am on this Zoom thing today.
All right. We're very, I was hoping that you would be able to make it today, Sharon. So I'm glad you did. And the beginning, since we recorded it and are still recording, you'll be able to catch it when I send out a link, so you can watch the beginning or the whole thing again, because there's so much information.
I know. And it's stuff that I, in my, I guess my life, my career, my things I've done, I've used some of this stuff with people, but not in such a framework. you know, when it's your life and you're not in a career anymore, you're not in a working and trying to help people deal with stuff in their lives. And it's, you know, you have more time, and it's hard sometimes to then have to look at your own stuff, you know, because when I was working 2 jobs, you know, I was outwardly focused, you know, on trying to help people get through stuff. And so I have talked about grief, but not in the same, you know, not in this clear cut kind of framework. And I love it. You know, it would be helpful if I was still, but you know, I have people that I'll come in touch with besides, you know, down the road, and not maybe in a work, you know, because life goes on as long as I'm here. Hopefully I'll be seeing people. I've become a hermit. I have really become a hermit over the last couple months. People that I used to talk to regularly, I haven't talked to. I've just had a lot of stuff, projects and stuff trying to deal with on my mind. So now
I know. A lot of us have become hermits, but you know, like I mentioned before, we need to keep going at our own pace, doing what we need to do. And sometimes it's good to stop and reflect to see, like Garrick said, you know, where are we and what's really going on. And sometimes, you know, when we have days that are not, and I'm looking at as a family caregiver, we have days where like, you might not feel quite as bubbly as you would normally. It's good to find that, think, you know, what's going on, where's that coming from, you know. And sometimes it could be for many reasons, you know, and one of them could be some sense of loss that we've had. And I know that Melissa, having been, I don't want to put you on the spot, Melissa, but you know, I don't know if you can relate to what was said and having experienced loss in recent past. How does it fit into your life? What did you think?
Yeah, it was very good. One thing that was interesting was when Garrick was talking about crying, and I'm a crier, so I don't have any problems with that. But my sister, you know, talked about, so my dad passed away November 2019 on the 23rd. My mother passed away on the 22nd of November 2021. So just one day shy of my dad's 2-year anniversary. And you know, my sister talked about, I didn't cry when Daddy died, and she didn't really cry when Mama died. And I think she has some other things going on, that the estrangement of her daughter, which meant her grandchildren have been taken away. You know, that happened in the course between my dad's death and my mom's death. And, you know, so I think there's a lot going on emotionally for her, but she's just never really been a crier. And you know, it's like, it's okay. So it was nice to hear Garrick, you know, confirm that, you know, no, you're not weird if you didn't cry. Everybody deals with things differently.
Yes, we're all different, you know. And one interesting thing that you mentioned, Melissa, thank you for sharing that, is that you never really know what's going on in the other person's life. And sometimes we see an ugly side that we're not used to seeing. And maybe they're having a difficult time with some loss in their own life that they haven't talked about. And you just see how they react to it, you know, and we might happen to be there at the wrong moment when they're having a hard time coping. Right. And I think that can come out at any time with anybody, really. Caregivers as well, our loved ones, our carees, definitely, because they cannot generally escape their condition. And many times, unless, you know, they're blessed with something that they can recover from, they don't recover. And every month, every year, they're worse, not better. You know, and they definitely cannot escape that. So definitely they are in a very, I don't know, good place to be grieving all of that loss. you know, every year. And we as caregivers or family members are watching it all. And that's also hard, which means that we are also in a position to see that loss and to grieve that loss, but hopefully it won't stop us, you know, and that's why hearing Garrick offer ways to deal with that, we can hopefully cope with it and manage it so that we can keep on living. And on top of that, keep on doing our job as a family caregiver in a compassionate, supportive way.
One thing I thought that was interesting was the timeline of like the second year being as difficult as the first. And I don't know, we'll see, because I know like with my dad, you know, we were so focused then when my dad passed that we had to be caregivers for our mom. So that, you know, maybe put grief on the back burner to some extent.
Yeah, you kind of work it.
Yeah, but the other thing that I thought about with, you know, when your loved one passes, and then you have to redefine who you are and figure out what you do with your time. And you know, my husband has said many times, what are you going to do with all the time that you're going to have after you get done? Because right now we're still in the throes of all the estate work, and I'm traveling back and forth like every month trying to get my parents' house cleaned out and trying to get it on the market to sell. So, you know, it's just constantly always, you know, things to be done. So maybe then, not that I haven't had the grief settle in, I absolutely have, but I'm also afraid sort of when I'm not as busy with that stuff, how difficult it might be.
That's where I think you can take the time if you want to and make an appointment with your grief, so you're not waiting for it to happen. All of us, you know, as the kind of like it jumps up from behind the bush. You know full well it's there. It's to some extent. So you make an appointment to say, hey, I really want to, you know, kind of feel my way into this. And so oftentimes people feel that when they are in a catch-up mourning situation that they're going to be overwhelmed by it. And for moments in time, you might feel overwhelmed by it, but this too shall pass. I mean, you don't ever stay in a state always, forever and always. And particularly when it comes to these intense emotions, they come with intensity, but then it's a period of time and then they lessen, and then you get perspective and you get deeper insights and learning from it. But sometimes being proactive and saying, I want to find out where this is. I want to feel those feelings and make an appointment to do that, so to speak. So you're not you're not caught off guard, as it were, just not allowing that thing to lurk and loom in the background, but you're saying, let's call it forward and say, okay, I want to meet you where you are. Show me.
Okay. That's a great idea.
That could be also something you work with a counselor on, or a friend on, where you've got some companionship, some companioning there, if that helps.
Yeah, well, in going through my parents' house and with my two sisters, it's difficult, but it's fun. You know, you sit there and you relive all these memories when you're looking at pictures or items, you know, around the house. And do you remember this? And so it's been a, you know, that's been a grief process too, that I think in somewhere, that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, and those things are really important because it's just, you grieve together. It's because, you know, grief must be witnessed. It's an important part of understanding that grief is to be witnessed, and then sharing that, you know, you get a chance to do exactly that for one another and for yourself. Your grief is witnessed, and you're witnessing others in grief, and that's a wonderful way of you know, it's difficult, challenging, horrific way of doing it, but it's you have a really wonderful opportunity there to be able to do that with your sisters.
Yeah.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
I wanted to just mention, I just posted the link to kitchentableconversations.org. And you can find the different topics that Garrick and team cover.
Let me share with you, if I can, the most immediate ones that are coming up next.
Okay.
That way I kind of give you a perspective. This is on end-of-life education. Advanced care planning is a 3-part series coming up starting May 3rd. So we'll check something. May 3rd and May 17th. Actually, that's May 17th, not 7th. So it's May 3rd, 17th, and 24th. And then also after death support and care is how do you make your final arrangements? And that's going to be on June the 7th. And then after this, for grief education, we'll be doing these 3 webinars in the month of May, which is what to say, what not to say to someone grieving, expected loss, coping with a disciplinary loss. And we'll do this webinar, this more of the content that was associated with this topic than we were able to cover today in our time, but it'll be a deeper dive into too much loss, coping with grief overload again. So those are the things coming up in May. And then there's a list of all the other dates and whatnot on the website as well. And Richard's just looking for all the May stuff now. It's free and sponsored by AARP.
Yes, thank you. All right. Does anybody else have anything else to share, to ask, to make a comment on to Garrick?
Okay, I want to say that was an awesome presentation, and even for myself, having so many losses in my family, each one is different. And what I've learned through time, different people, have different things, like Garrick was saying, it's how you were brought up and what have you. Sometimes I just don't really show people how I feel or whatever. I just kind of suppress it, and I'm better handling other people than myself sometimes, because I know sometimes it's better not to say something than to say something wrong. So sometimes I just give a hug or just give a smile or just, offer my help physically than just to saying something, because sometimes we can say the wrong thing and we don't mean any harm by anything. It's like when we lost our son, my sister used to tease my husband. Every time we see him, he's just crying. And, that was his son. So what do they expect? So I'm trying not to be emotional, but it's just so hard going through the grieving and the loss and just all of that. And you just have so many mixed emotions and what have you. Even like my present condition now, my husband is not dead, but I still go through so many emotions. Like, what am I going to do? What's going to happen? And people say they're there for you, but people are not always there for you. So I've learned not to depend totally on people. This is my support group right here. Because sometimes we can be too personal with people and we expect some, well, not me, I don't really expect, but I'm just saying people in general, we expect too much. But here, I don't know you all personally, but I feel like I have a closer bond with you because you don't judge. And that's, and right now, I don't know where I am. Because listen to this, it brings back memories, it brings back, different things. I didn't even know this was going to happen, but it's just so many things that you have to go through. After losing a mother, father, 3 sisters, a brother, son, and it just goes on and on and on and on. What do you do? How do you get through? There's no time grieving. There's no time getting over it. Everybody have a different way of handling things, and I normally handle things pretty well, but here lately, I guess, I'm getting older and I don't know if that's what it is, but it's harder now than it used to be. So, I enjoyed the presentation. It just, made me look at some more things in different ways. So I'm going to stop because I don't want to just fall. But anyway, thank you. I'm going back on mute.
Thank you, Eunice. You're beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And let me tell you, we're all human, no matter how old we are. At this funeral I attended yesterday was for Ina's mother, and I was reliving my mother's funeral, and I just fell apart, and I thought, God forgive me, I'm supposed to be grieving, this beautiful lady, but it's like my mother and the Ave Maria and the Amazing Grace, and they were sung at, my parents, and oh my gosh, it's just like this was for Mom. And my mother's funeral mass was in Maryland. That's where she's buried. But we had a memorial service for her here. So I saw what took place in Maryland that I missed, you know, and it was just like, and she had short blonde hair with the frameless big lens glasses, just like my mother's. I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, so it was very hard. And at the same time, it was beautiful because it was a beautiful church and mass and everything. And I just pictured, oh, this must have been what happened for my mother, you know, similar, of course, you know, so it was bittersweet, but that came on suddenly. I certainly was not expecting that to happen, you know. And I said earlier, when my mother passed, I did not cry. Well, I cried yesterday, you know, almost 5 years later, it happened, you know. So, you know, they're always with us, and remember, we are all human beings, and it is okay to feel, you know, and it is also okay, at least in my opinion, is to feel, to talk about it, but also to look for the good stuff. You know, I read somewhere it's good to vent, but it's better to vent with somebody who is going to help you move forward, not just to vent and stay stuck where you are for the rest of your life, because I personally don't believe that that's very healthy. So because we're still living, you know, and we still have purpose. So anyway, that was beautiful, Eunice. Thank you for sharing that.